Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic.
And I'm Emma Green. I'm the assistant managing editor of theatlantic.com.
And it is good to have you here in your first Blogging Heads appearance. Welcome. Um,
Thank you. Thank you.
we wanted to start today by talking about religious liberty and non discrimination and the way that they intersect. This has been much in the news lately with these stories in Indiana. About what is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Do I have that right?
Yep.
Um,
Yep, that's right.
and I've written a couple pieces on this, and I guess one of the arguments that I've been making, and I'm curious to know what you think about this. Um, Obviously, on gay marriage, there's been a sea change in public opinion over the last 15 years, and
Right.
one thing that strikes me is, as recently as 2008, the kind of Democratic Party enthusiastically embraced a nominee, Barack Obama, that everybody was really excited about in a way they hadn't been excited about a presidential candidate in a long time. And he was someone who, at that time, his position was that gay marriage should be illegal, that marriage should be between a man and a woman.
Right.
This was Hillary Clinton's position until 2013. Basically, we've seen a tremendous shift just in the last few years on this issue. And it's strange to me that we've gone from having these national politicians who took this position and kind of changed their minds, and everyone kind of thought that this was a perfectly acceptable evolution. And younger people thought, oh, well, they're older and it took them more time to get this than me, and it was kind of okay. But now that that's happened, we have these kind of holdouts in different parts of the country. I mean, really like 40% of the country, but far less among the media and among politicians. But now the position of holding out is considered to be so verboten that the people who hold it have to be shamed and treated as bigots, as the equivalent of as the equivalent of how we treat racists. Basically, is how at least a subset of people on the other side of the issue want to treat people who haven't come around, or maybe will never hold this position. And there's just something that strikes me as weird about watching that. It seems like a contradiction to me.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a contradiction just because I do think there always has been a vocal minority that used the type of language that we've heard, for example, in the Indiana reefer debate,
Uh-huh.
where the word bigot is used, or sort of really extreme radical language is applied to people who have views that are in opposition to same-sex marriage.
Right.
I think the difference might be that the legal changes, the judicial changes that have happened since Windsor in the summer of 2013, I think have created a legitimacy around same-sex marriage, and now it has this air of inevitability. All of these states, either the body of voters is voting to overturn the constitutional bans on same-sex marriage, or in most cases, these courts have overturned the constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. And it just seems inevitable that it's going to become legal across our country. I mean, we'll have to see what the Supreme Court does. But I think that maybe creates a sense of legitimacy and sort of like a legal seal of approval almost to this idea of same-sex marriage as a fundamental civil right that, you know, should be cherished and held by people across the country. And so perhaps that has empowered and emboldened a broader segment of people who maybe were same-sex marriage supporters but might not have been as vocal. And certainly, I do think it creates this sense on the other side of retreat and persecution, which is that, especially among evangelical Christians, for example, there seems to be this vibe, this feel that, you know, cake bakers or photographers or whomever are going to be forced to participate in ceremonies in ways that they might not theoretically feel okay with in terms of their religious beliefs. But there's sort of this sense that they're going to be forced to by secular society. Yeah. And I certainly think that that dynamic also creates sort of an antagonism that is maybe more loaded than it has been.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. And I think it's interesting to me that, you know, you can imagine lots of different terrains on which this fight between religious liberty on the one hand and non-discrimination law on the other hand might happen.
Totally.
And it's interesting to me that this is where it's happening around participation in same-sex wedding ceremonies, because it seems to me to be like a very marginal example for both sides in a way. Like in the grand scope of gay rights, the right not to be denied a particular bakery that does serve you, but like doesn't want to serve your wedding, right? Or doesn't want to bake you a wedding cake. It's like pretty marginal in the grand scheme of gay rights compared to other things that gay rights, both nationally and globally, are fighting for. And then with respect to religious liberty, just whether in a historical context or even in a contemporary context, especially in other countries with Christians being slaughtered in some places, with other religious minorities, Sunnis and Shiites, being slaughtered for their religions.
Totally.
We're talking about the religious liberty to like not bake a cake for a gay wedding, which also seems very, this isn't being thrown into the Colosseum with the lions. So there is this interesting sense, not to diminish the genuine concern that people have. And I actually understand where both sides, I think, emotionally and in principle are coming on this, but there is a weirdness, I think, to this being the terrain where this huge fight is happening. And I wonder if fighting it at this terrain is going to have an outcome that kind of has like weird implications for other parts of the fight that are maybe more relevant.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I mean, in a lot of ways, and this is kind of different, but it reminds me of the great Chick-fil-A controversy of several years ago, where it came out that Chick-fil-A was donating tons of money to the Prop 8 campaign in California, and also generally anti-gay marriage types of political funds. And so there's obviously this big outcry from same-sex marriage supporters, calls for boycotts of Chick-fil-A. And the interesting element, and the reason why to me those two examples are associated, is that they're about first of all, the obligations of private business owners, and second, sort of where you consume your goods and services, and whether or not some sort of ideological position, for example, support of same-sex marriage or opposition to same-sex marriage, should define your consumer life. So I would say that's one piece of it. To me, there's also, it's an interesting thing, the same-sex marriage example, like specifically wedding ceremonies, because it's actually one of the few examples where you can think of something that's explicitly participating in something where you might have a claim that that thing in itself is the thing that you object to. So it's not the person. Yeah. I'm not refusing to serve someone who looks gay when they come into my restaurant. It's more, I'm refusing to participate in some sort of rite of passage or ceremony that to me specifically represents a violation of my religious belief. And it's actually kind of difficult to come up with an analog example that might appear in another part of life, because there are very few other times when gay gender identity is so explicit and you have such an explicit piece of evidence that someone is going to engage in gay sex under the context of marriage in a way that might be specifically objectionable to someone who has that belief. So I totally agree with you that it's funny, because like cake baking, when you say it out loud, sounds kind of silly and trivial, especially if you consider it to, other kinds of religious persecution that go on in other parts of the world. But it also is almost like the perfect storm example of where you exactly come into conflict with people having to sort of like confront the very thing that they object to.
Yeah, but there's a bunch of threads I want to pick up here, and one of them is cake baking is interesting because the First Amendment protects both religion and speech, basically, and people have focused on, understandably, the religious component of the protection and what that means and how you flesh that out in case law. And I think that there was one case about a photographer who didn't want to photograph a same-sex wedding. To me, that raised a different First Amendment concern, a free expression concern. In other words, I'm pretty attuned to these cases, being a journalist, and photojournalists are generally accorded the same, and photo artists, for that matter, are accorded the same First Amendment protections as I am as far as free expression. And there's something creepy to me about coerced speech that I think like doesn't apply to this business in Indiana that doesn't want to serve pizza, right? I don't think that that's compelled speech. If you were to make, but I do think that like forcing someone to write a narrative of the wedding, which some people actually have, like a video voiceover or whatever, or to take photographs of the wedding. And I don't know kind of where like decorating a wedding cake and also being a florist, which are both kind of creative pursuits that someone could plausibly argue this is like creative expression that I put myself into, and like I don't want to denigrate. Like I don't identify with that. Never having been a florist, never. I don't know. It just seems different to me. But also, I understand. I don't want to dismiss it either. I think that there are creative professionals who like take.
You're being so rude to florists.
But no, I think maybe florists should be protected under that kind of First Amendment analysis. But I just think it's an example of, like, I do think that there are different rights that we generally hold very closely that are in tension here. And I think that, I don't know, I think that the people who are on the kind of shaming these businesses and wanting to like find them aren't fully recognizing the rights at stake. And because we hold free speech so sacrosanct, right? Like almost no one disagrees that you could stand on the street, on a public street, and protest gays in a way that is just like virulently bigoted, right? You could hold up signs with gay slurs on them, and you could shout at people as they walk by, "You're going to hell, God hates you." You know, you could say like the most awful things.
Right.
And this would be legal and you couldn't be fined for doing this, right? On the other hand, if you're like, well, I really actually like gay people a lot personally, and I have a lot of them that come into my business, and we have really friendly interactions. I don't want to actually serve their wedding just because I have a thing about marriage being a sacrament, but I don't have animus toward them. Like that position is punished more severely in some places than this other thing that's like obviously animus and bigotry. And I think the reason for it is because I think that the civil rights movement has attuned us to thinking of like discrimination in businesses as this different category of things. And I think that there's a good reason for that during the civil rights movement, to draw that distinction and to have the laws and the case law that came out of it. But it's interesting to see the way in which, like when we're thinking about applying social stigma as opposed to legal stigma, and even when we're applying legal stigma, in this case, it's being directed at something that's not actually the most virulent and hateful and bigoted thing out there that like still exists, unfortunately, against gays in the United States.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting observation. And I think, and this is entering a little bit into like amateur legal analysis territory for me, but
that's definitely a lot here on Blogging Heads.
Oh, great. I am glad that I can fully fly my amateur flag.
Yes.
But so I think what you've hit on is the right distinction, which is there may be elements, for example, in the Elaine photography case, of it being a free speech concern, but it's also a non-discrimination concern. And I think when you think about gaming out, what are the implications in a free society for someone standing on a sidewalk screaming bigoted things versus someone in a free society saying, I don't want to provide goods and services to someone based on ostensibly their gender identity. I mean, that's the argument, but also their participation in something that I find to be objectionable based on my beliefs.
Right.
I mean, I don't know the exact differentiation in terms of case law there, but you could argue just from a theoretical perspective that it's much more damaging to pluralism to create these different spheres, particularly in the sphere of commerce, where people can designate something as offensive to their particular religious belief. And basically the government has no way, this is pretty consistent, I think, in legal affairs, where the government is not sort of sussing out, well, do you actually believe that? It's more that the government, if there's evidence that it's an authentic claim of religious belief, the government kind of has to take you at face value.
Yeah.
And so if somebody is making that claim, and then you're able to carve out these spheres whereby certain people are not able to be sold goods and services, and then certain people can't consume certain kinds of goods and services, it creates, to me, a much more fundamental division and a much more, it undermines pluralism, I think, in a much more robust way, because when someone is standing on a sidewalk and they're yelling, what they're doing is basically using their voice in a public sphere, and that's all. It might have an emotional impact on somebody who goes past them. It might, change somebody's mind, and that's theoretically the point of free speech. But it's not. It's sort of explicit and totally surfaced in a way that the subtle discrimination that would happen if there are sort of these separated spheres in the realm of commerce is not. And to me, that's again sort of the relation to the Chick-fil-A case, which is like, is a truly free society that protects religious liberty one where you basically don't have to interact in a commerce setting with people who you disagree with their lifestyle on, and where you don't have to encounter people who are making life choices, particularly committing to same-sex marriages, that kind of thing, that you disagree with.
Yeah.
And I think that's much more undermining to pluralism.
Interesting. So I've kind of complicated thinking on this. On one hand, I think I agree with part of what you're saying, because if it was the case that a restaurant was saying, I'm not going to serve gay patrons when they just walk in the door, right? And even if this was, as it would, of course, be a tiny number of restaurants in the United States, right? Nothing like the Jim Crow environment where you had most establishments. But even if it was just, a handful of people that did this, you could easily find another restaurant to eat at. But at the same time, I do think that would pose a kind of, let's call it a significant burden. Because, you go into a restaurant, there's an unpredictability involved. There's a chilling effect of hiding your identity. There's also, you might go in, it might prevent you from having a particular important lunch with colleagues, or you show up for a date, right? Or
right.
There's all kinds of unpredictability that it introduces. So, personally, I would certainly boycott any business with that policy. And I don't really, when we're drawing up the liberty versus non-discrimination thing, I can't bring myself to really object to outlawing that kind of discrimination in the same way that we do for race for sexual orientation.
Right.
I do think that I feel differently about the gay wedding, declining to serve a gay wedding, for a couple of reasons. I think one distinction is that you raised earlier, and that I agree with, the person event distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a gay wedding is a distinct thing from how one feels about gay people. And I also think that there are actually lots of so another distinction is that it's not a public accommodation, right? This is something that you plan in advance. You're not going to show up and have this surprise. The burden on people is significantly less if it's just I have to call a different wedding vendor, which is something that everyone plans a wedding does all the time. And so I think that that's a significant difference. But if we could set aside just talking about how this relates to gays for a minute and talk about commerce and discrimination more generally. It seems to me that one way we could go as a society is just okay, commerce is this realm where no one can discriminate against anyone, full stop, right? You have to basically serve anyone who goes to your establishment, anyone who wants to buy your services. And that would seem to introduce a kind of easiness into things. In fact, it might even help some people with strong moral beliefs or religious beliefs to get along, because they could tell themselves, oh, well, I have no choice. And having that no choice might solve their conscience in some way, or change their notion of what their religious obligations are.
Right.
At the same time, my instinct or my intuition is that if I'm, say, a Christian caterer, say I'm a family, an Italian restaurant, and I work with my wife and my 2 high school age kids, and we cater things, right? Or let's say college age kids, which will be easier for the example I'm going to use. And, I'm devoutly religious. Maybe I'm Christian, maybe I'm Muslim. And the local, there's a local pornography film festival that wants me to cater it. Am I compelled to do that because I have to serve anyone? What if I'm an atheist business owner and it's it's a a Christian organization that is just like violently against atheists and wants them to be banned from being able to run for public office, and takes all sorts of extreme positions, right? Like, does a black business owner have to serve the Ku Klux Klan at a rally? Like, I think our intuition is that in some of these cases, well, no, of course, there's, whatever value you get from non-discrimination generally, you're imposing a much bigger burden on these individual people that's basically unnecessary if you just never allow anyone to discriminate.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, which is it a compelling government interest to force all business owners to not be able to make subjective judgments based on their personal beliefs, whether it's religious or philosophical or whatever, to interact with other groups that they object to in the realm of commerce? That's like a really fascinating question. And I would imagine there are a couple of complicating and interesting factors here. The first is the group that is being talked about one that is a minority such that they're protected under anti-discrimination statutes? Because, like, for example, the Ku Klux Klan is not a protected class. I mean, they're an organization.
Yeah.
But, like, they're just some group. It's not like they are, a minority that has been systematically discriminated against because of the legal environment and former legacy of slavery in the United States for hundreds of years. So I think that's one distinction. Not every group is the same, and I think not every group is the same legally. And I think another distinction is trying to figure out what the reasoning is behind accepting a job versus declining a job. Because, for example, like, cake bakers decline jobs all the time. Maybe they're really busy. Maybe they want to take a vacation. Maybe their oven is broken, whatever. And it's an interesting thing because you could imagine a scenario in which the husband and wife who own a Lane Photography could have just gotten this request to do photography at a wedding, and they could have, like, had a conversation one night in their living room in the privacy of their own home and just said, oh, we don't want to do this, we'll just decline. And, written an email back and said, so sorry, we just can't really do this. We're going to decline the offer.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And there's no reasoning that's surfaced that is specifically tied to objecting to the same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to imagine that that's happened before.
Oh, yeah.
It's just that it's not legally actionable because, fortunately enough, the judiciary of the United States is not thought police, and they can't see people's thoughts, and they don't have legal action going after sort of people, what's in people's hearts, but what they don't say. So I think that's another thing that's complicated and interesting. And that sort of goes back to the chilling effect that you were mentioning before, but it goes in the other direction, which is you can imagine that one chilling effect of how all of these legal cases are going, where there's a cake baker who says, no, I won't serve your wedding because you're gay. Mm-hmm. And then there's legal action, and then Christians see that, and they're a small business owner, and they say to themselves, okay, is there a way legally that I can decline to participate in these kinds of ceremonies without getting myself into trouble or being exposed to fines?
Yeah.
And part of that is the privatization of their beliefs.
Yeah.
And so that in itself is a little bit of a chilling effect. And I would say that is probably a component of the religious liberty argument, which is that people who do have objections to this should be able to state those objections without being subject to fines or legal action or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think it's complicated.
Yeah. And you also, once you start, once you have a non-discrimination law in place, it's true that you're generally going to have lawsuits involving explicit refusals based on a protected category. But not necessarily, you still open the door to people who get their wedding declined, and maybe the photographer just was going on vacation, but the person suspects that it was because they were a member of a protected class, and then you have a legal proceeding where you're trying to prove that, and this is definitely necessary in cases of racial discrimination, right? You have lawsuits against, say, a company for not promoting black people at the same rate as white people, and you go through a pretty complicated analysis to try and tease out, well, is this actually a factor? Is this a factor even if intentional discrimination isn't going on, and it's just unintentional, but nevertheless damaging discrimination that's happening. And,
Right.
and so so it's one cost, I think, of like one cost of having a protected class is creating the conditions for lots of lawsuits, some of which are going to have merit and some of which aren't. And
Yeah.
it's the reason why we don't have, like, why everything isn't a protected class. In other words, there are lots of kinds of discrimination that we would find like morally creepy, you know? And it's not a protected class because, not because we're saying it's morally okay, but because it just doesn't happen enough to matter. It would be weird if a restaurant declined to serve anyone who
wears the color green or something.
Well, yeah, I mean, where's the color green is like as good an example as any. But even refuses to serve anyone who is who they find physically attractive. Right? There's like a guy at the door rating people on a scale of 1 to 10, and if you fall below 8, then you're not getting in. Right?
Right.
And there's all kinds of things we consider creepy. Not that actually doesn't literally happen at some clubs in America. So maybe it's not the best example. But
I mean, that's why bouncers exist.
But yeah, we would find it creepy in a restaurant or a grocery store or whatever. But it's not illegal because it doesn't really come up. And I worry actually that because this is becoming a focus of two warring parties in the culture war, it's going to come up when it doesn't have to, right? And I think that actually the Indiana case that I wrote about, this pizzeria, is a perfect example of this. It's an establishment that would never be asked to cater any wedding, gay or straight, that never has been asked to cater a wedding in the history of a business. A reporter comes in,
Right.
asks, would you be willing to cater a gay wedding? And the person is like, well, I serve gay customers all the time, but no, I wouldn't be willing to cater a gay wedding. And they become the object of this fight. When actually, like, I think that they should not be, in part because this would never come up. Like it's kind of like the wisdom of having to have standing to bring a lawsuit, because we only want to adjudicate controversies that actually have relevance. We don't want to waste court resources. In the same way,
right.
I think there's a wisdom in not expending our culture war participating resources on these cases that are just totally hypothetical. And all the people involved are just going to go through a lot of terrible angst and anger and shouting at each other, all for something that would never actually happen in real life.
Yeah, I think something that you've touched on here is less the legal adjudication in that issue and more sort of the social and cultural outrage factor.
Yeah.
Which is, especially on the internet, how does outrage culture sort of create and shape social mores, and particularly around same-sex marriage. And we've seen this with Indiana and Arkansas this week with the RFRA stuff. But it's an interesting thing because to me, the culture war framework is so old school, and it almost feels, it's not that it's irrelevant, but it almost feels anachronistic here, because culture war is very much sort of like this associative intelligence concept where everybody who has sort of a quote unquote conservative associative set of beliefs, even if they're different, sort of lumped together on social issues. Mm-hmm. And then everyone who has quote unquote liberal or progressive beliefs sort of clumped together in opposition to one another. I think there are a few aspects of this that sort of go back to reinforce that, and then I think there are a few aspects of it totally undermine it. And I think on the one hand, you could say that the polarization factor, so a total lack of empathy for an evangelical Christian who holds these views about same-sex marriage.
Right.
That is sort of polarization that I think is characteristic of what you might call the culture war framework.
Yeah.
And I think on the other side, it's true too. People who are, say, evangelical Christians, and they can't empathize with someone who has a desire to become married to their life partner. And that is very much polarized. But I think the very fact that this issue has been moving so rapidly and public opinion has been moving so rapidly. And a lot of it is actually on a micro level, which is there are studies that show that people meeting someone who's gay or having a gay partner pair in their community actually influences what they think about this policy issue.
Yeah.
Shows that it really is actually, it's not really that macro and sort of abstract in that you like put yourself into one camp or the other. For most people, I think for a lot of people, it's sort of like, well, I don't know, my gay neighbors down the street, they should probably be able to get married if they want to, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
And I think another way that you see this, this is one of my favorite social science findings. There was a study last spring, I believe it was by the Public Religion Research Institute, and it showed that there's actually a division. There's a group of people, it's like 10% in a public opinion survey, who believed that gay marriage should be legal, but they also think that gay sex is morally wrong. And that right there is a stat that totally undermines the culture war framework, because it shows that there's a group of people who can hold the two ideas in their head at the same time, that I can have this moral belief and personally believe that something is wrong, but I also think that in the legal sphere there should be some flexibility on it, and sort of shows that you can like hold that pluralistic tension and still be fine. So what I'll be interested in, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the culture war, I think, though, is, I think insofar as it still exists, and historically, it's always been waged by a vocal minority that has views that are less nuanced and complicated than the average person. And I think that, in cases that we're seeing lately, it's mapping on to these technological changes that are allowing people to communicate in a couple of ways that matter for how debates play out. One way is that people are interacting within social networks where they're seeing the opinions and the shares and the comments of people who are part of their close social group and that they tend to agree with already. And that, I think, tends to make people's views more extreme and to decrease their empathy. And I think that there's also this signaling aspect where in some communities, raging against the other that your group doesn't have empathy for is a status-raising thing. And in the age of social media, it's a status thing that's like can be measured like in the number of likes that you're getting, right?
Right.
And I think that there's finally this sense in which these social media shaming cycles, they just put everyone on the defensive in a way that makes it very hard to operate on the level of persuasion anymore. If I was in this Indiana town and it was just a story in the local newspaper that had their comments about how they wouldn't serve a gay wedding, right? If I was a regular at that pizza place, I would go the next time I was in there and I was just, having a friendly chat with the people there, I would say, I really think you guys should rethink what you said in the newspaper the other day. I've thought a lot about Christianity. I went to Catholic school for 14 years. I really don't think you have a religious obligation to do this. And in fact, I think there's a pretty strong case that the Christian thing to do here is to actually serve this wedding. It doesn't mean you have to agree with the institution of gay marriage, but here are the reasons I think that you ought to rethink this, right? And I could have that friendly conversation, and insofar as disagreeing with someone is like exercising a small amount of social shaming, right? I think that I can imagine that being like a productive, persuasive encounter. And I think that what's one thing that's been lost here, people talk about social shaming as opposed to state coercion, right? But traditionally, when we talk about social shaming, we're talking about people who are like within the community and social world of the people who are being targeted by it, who are being told, like, actually, I think this isn't an okay thing to think, right? I don't think that social shaming works on the scale of like thousands of strangers berating you. Because you don't have the whatever level of intimacy and closeness or even like proximity in order to do it in the way that it's always been done before.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you and I don't, which is in the sense that the public sphere, when you think about it, I mean, it's this made up concept that gets tossed around all the time.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, it's exactly what you're describing, which is, I mean, it could be a lot of different things, but
Yeah.
it is two people sitting down in a restaurant and exchanging viewpoints such that there's this back and forth, this tension that slowly over time through micro increments sort of shapes an overall landscape of pluralistic points of view in a society that can shift in all sorts of different ways, arguably through persuasion. But I do think there are cases where, and I don't think this is, again, like wholesale support for outrage campaigns.
Yeah.
But when you look at the Indiana RFRA law, right? I mean, there's a lot of debate among legal scholars about what kind of threat this would actually pose. And I know there are some people who don't actually believe that the state level RFRA that was originally crafted in Indiana was actually substance or grounds for discrimination against people who were gay.
Right. Yeah.
For lots of different sort of technical reasons. And that's sort of one issue aside. But I guess insofar as there were other legal scholars who were arguing that this was different, our very own writer Garrett Epps was one who said that there was a language change in the Indiana state RFRA that is different than the federal level RFRA, which is the law that was passed in the 90s, which all of these state laws are being modeled off of, such that the threshold for a religious freedom claim would be much, much lower in terms of the burden that was being placed on the person who's making the claim. So all of that is to say, there were people who know what they're talking about on either side of this.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Insofar as this represented a real threat, it's good that, people who believe really strongly in equality for gay people, who support same-sex marriage, who want Indiana to be a state where everybody is welcome, it's good that they were able to mobilize and they made change happen. I mean, Mike Pence got beaten down by the internet, basically, and by protesters.
Oh,
and
yeah. I mean, to be clear, I think that shaming against states, politicians, legislatures can work on the mass level, and like always has worked on the mass level, as opposed to shaming individuals, which I think works less on the mass level, if I could draw that distinction.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting distinction too, because you have to ask yourself, what is the point of this? The point of this for a state level official like Mike Pence is to actually create public policy change.
Right.
The point of it for a person is to make them feel bad.
Right.
Or to show that you're morally superior to them. It's not
right.
to persuade them. And it's certainly not to sort of offer empathy in an exchange of persuasion in the hopes of, formulating a more perfect society or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's a right distinction for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually one thorny question that I tried to pose in my piece, and that I don't think a lot of people who are shaming individuals over these kinds of things have grappled with, is like, okay, so let's set aside the disagreement of like whether people should be punished for holding this view, and just look at the people who think, okay, yes, people should be punished, whether through the state or whether through like less formal but nonetheless potent means. Like if you won't serve a gay wedding with your pizza or your photography or whatever, you ought to be punished. So once we accept that position, for the sake of argument at least, the question is, what is the appropriate punishment? And I think this is relevant because the punishments being handed out are pretty extreme. Like is the appropriate punishment, you should lose your business and your life savings and have to find a different livelihood?
Right.
Or is it like you have to have a $50 fine, right?
Right.
And you could imagine, and actually there's one interesting post, I forget who wrote it, on the Huffington Post, who was saying what they thought the rule should be is that if you're going to be someone who declines to serve a gay wedding, you have to advertise that. You have to put that. I think they wanted a sign in the store, which seems like actually would just make people feel angry and upset who are gay, who are coming into the store.
Right.
I don't know if that's like the actual, but you can imagine like a registry. If you're like a wedding provider, you have to advertise that, and other people can choose not to do business with you, and people will not have the experience of like going to the florist all excited because they're planning a wedding and they're like just got engaged and it's like a great moment, and then they have this like awful, oh well, I don't want to serve your wedding. You could avoid that kind of interaction. So there are all kinds of compromised positions, even among people who want to impose penalties, that are before, threaten to burn your pizza store down, as one person did, or, put you out of business. And I just can't, I don't know, especially given that the people who support gay marriage in the United States are generally people who are richer and more highly educated and have more social power. And people who oppose gay marriage in the United States are generally, if you look at group opinion, is disproportionately poorer people, disproportionately people in rural places, disproportionately immigrants, disproportionately blacks compared to whites.
Right.
It would have a lot of perverse consequences if people were to start going around as activists, just asking everyone, would you cater a gay wedding? And then trying to put everyone who wouldn't out of business. It would certainly be something that fell disproportionately on powerless people and minorities in a way that we find creepy when it's anything else.
Right, totally. Yeah, I think to me, the two important concepts there for trying to suss out what that appropriate level of punishment is are, first of all, scale. So this is back to a point that you made a long time ago, but it's not like there are these vigilantes who, there are some people who actually commit acts of violence against gay people, and that is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
But, people who just have sort of a passive objection to same-sex marriage, it's not like they're going out on these vigilante raids and killing people who are participating in same-sex marriages, and that would be awful, obviously, and a totally different kind of thing. But I think because it's a different kind, it's a different sort of quality of objection and ideological difference. It's important to meet that kind. So losing your business is a pretty extreme example. But I don't know, if you're in a town and say it comes out in the town that you're, kind of anti same-sex marriage, and maybe anti-gay, maybe not. Maybe you're not even someone who really has anti-gay beliefs. You just, for religious reasons, don't believe in same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
And some people either wanted to come into your restaurant or persuade you, or they just decided they didn't want to go to that restaurant anymore because they didn't feel comfortable in that space or whatever.
Yeah.
I feel like that is the kind of nudging social moire change that is actually really important and effective. And this goes back to John Stuart Mill talking about, the power of people who interact with their rude neighbor, and they're sort of, by criticizing that rude neighbor and pushing around that rude neighbor a little bit, they're able to stay within these boundaries of liberty, but also make change socially so that people can't be sort of flagrantly violating social mores with no recourse for people who disagree with them.
Yeah.
And that goes to the second quality that I think is super important here, which is civility, which is always holding, in cases that are about ideology and belief, and that seem to be sort of sincerely held beliefs that are coming from a place where someone earnestly just has an ideological difference, being civil about the way that you exchange intention with that person or that business or whatever, I think is a core premise of being able to be in a pluralistic society. And I don't think civility is trashing people on Twitter. I don't think civility is, threats to burn down the Memories Pizza shop in Indiana.
Yeah. I agree with a lot of that. And I'm much more okay with the actual patrons of a business making individual decisions about, for whatever reason, this isn't the kind of business that I want to support. I think that that's totally legitimate and different from I think that there's a distinction from a boycott with what's going on with this Indiana restaurant that's had to literally shut down because of a combination of threats and having all of their phones and social media present, or not social media, but Yelp reviews and everything overwhelmed by people who've literally never been there and never would go, not actual customers, people from outside the community. But yeah, generally, I agree that, if people in that community decided that they wanted to, again, go in there and tell them face to face, I think you're wrong about this, that's one approach. Another approach is just stop patronizing there. And I think that that's a totally fine and defensible thing to do. I would only add one more caveat that Well, I think that social nudging can be appropriate. I also think that um, there's also a degree of like, I would hate to live in a town or a country where we started making lots of these polarizing things the deciding factor in whether a business is shut down. I mean, like I'm thinking, for example, of if people just started like publicizing whether a restaurant owner or any business owner is pro-life or pro-choice, right? Um,
Right.
like people feel very strongly about this, understandably so, on both sides, given the philosophical presumptions behind both positions, and it just seems needlessly polarizing and like it seems to serve no purpose and harm society in various ways if we were to start really focusing on people's positions on that and to make our consumer choices based on it.
Totally. I completely agree with you. And I think to me, I want to add a caveat to what I said because to me, I feel like if someone came to know, like, say it's the situation of an op ed published in the newspaper, like you're talking about,
Yeah, yeah,
someone came to know that somebody's views were this, and they just had some personal reason for feeling uncomfortable in that context, I would never blame that person for not wanting to go there.
right, yeah,
But I totally agree with you that in general, everyone benefits from limiting the spheres of life in which explicit politicization creates sort of a balkanization in who talks to whom and who interacts with whom in whatever spheres.
yeah,
Like I think as many times as you can have sort of interactions where different viewpoints come into conflict with one another
mm-hmm.
or come into contact. Like you have to be on the PTA with a mother who holds pretty different worldviews than you, but you start to understand where she's coming from over the course of years and years and years of having your kids do school activities together. Whether it's, having people who you totally disagree with who all go to the coffee shop together and, through exposure over time, there's more understanding that happens.
Right.
I think that kind of encounter is fundamental to the health of a public sphere and the health of a pluralistic society. So I definitely agree with you that I don't think that it's a good thing to have sort of this ideological balkanization in all spheres of life because ultimately that will result in sort of an ossification of what people already think. And it's this reinforcement thing that you're talking about before with social media, where people only surround themselves with people who totally share their worldview in every part of their life.
So we're coming up on an hour, but I want to ask one more question before we close. This is something I've kind of been thinking about and curious about that related to this topic. One thing that's actually surprised me about just seeing kind of people argue online about this is that there does seem to be this this lack of empathy that you talked about earlier going in both directions for people with the opposite position on this issue. And this surprises me in part because when I look at the polling numbers, the generational change is so distinct, right? Much more, like more than ideology. A person's age and generation tells you more reliably where they're going to fall on this issue. And so it seems to me that there must be lots of people who are like shaming people who don't want to serve at gay weddings, for example, whose own parents or grandparents, certainly grandparents, are against gay marriage. And like, I can't imagine that they would want their own parents or grandparents like fired from their jobs or ostracized in the way that they're ostracizing these business owners. And likewise, it seems as though the like virulent extreme on the anti-gay marriage side, like must have kids or at least friends of their kids that like expose them to different positions on this issue, and that in fact like are gay, and that they would, and I guess this is happening. Like part of why public opinion is changing so fast is that people, unlike in previous generations, are encountering gay people, and this is changing their minds.
Totally.
So I should say, that is happening. But yeah, the generational aspect would lead me to believe that it would be a less polarized debate than it is, because generation and not ideology is like the more salient factor, and that would just seem to like put people into contact with people of different positions that they empathize with.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. A lot because the example of parent or grandparent, I think, is really powerful because, like, who feels comfortable trashing their grandma or thinking, even if you like took a moment to think about someone like, say, Brendan Eich
Right,
in the context of like being a dad. I don't know if he actually is a dad, but being like, someone's uncle or something,
right.
like that frames that person in a very different light, and it's something that you can empathize with automatically because everyone has a family. Everyone can empathize with what it's like to be part of someone's immediate, nuclear family or whatever extended family community.
Mm.
So I think part of this is, it goes back to what we were talking about internet spheres, or spheres on social media, which is that I think there's a distancing effect that happens when even you're like reading a news story about, Memories Pizza, and it's very far away in Indiana and it feels very distant from you, and you're talking about it on social media. I think there definitely is a dehumanization factor that happens because you're not talking to that person face to face. You're not having to look at them and see, oh, yeah, you have the same dinky shoes that my dad does, or, oh, I see that you have kids. Like, you are sort of a person just like me. And I think that both happens because, people are sort of sitting behind their computer screens and sort of anonymously type and
Right.
tweet things, and they don't feel like there are consequences. But I think in general, when you get into issues like this, it's really easy to think of someone sort of decoupled from their humanity and think of someone just as a political symbol. And this goes back to why I think it's so important to not have the politicization of different spheres of life, because I think that lends itself to people having less human empathy for others and sort of seeing them as people rather than as symbols of an ideology.
Well, I think that is a good note to end. We haven't gotten to various pieces that you've written, so I encourage everyone to go to Emma's Atlantic page and look at some of the excellent stuff that she's been writing recently. And
Oh,
I hope you come back
thanks,
on and we
Connor.
do it again and get to some other topics.
Huzzah! Yes, and people should go to Connor's page too. Ha ha ha. Anyways, this is great, Connor.